I'm making a video game. Last time we covered me being an idiot, and I pledged to make sure the next video would finally cover level design. I might have been lying. If you want to find out, let's talk game design. But first, you're all still doing excellent work in the comments. I had this comment about speeding up the float mode, because getting back to the point that you died might be tedious, and I ignored it. Alright, I didn't, but I did sort of fix the problem anyway, introducing the checkpoint system. The levels can get quite long, so there's now a checkpoint at roughly the halfway point. Next time you die, you'll respawn here, which cuts down on the amount of challenge I'm asking the player to do in one chunk. Some levels might even have more than one checkpoint depending on their difficulty. Now you'll never have to scroll more than half the level in float mode to get back to where you died. So technically, I've just made float mode at least twice as fast. I received another comment that the transition noise in my videos was horrific. And one more, which might be the most weirdly specific comment I've had so far, asking for a giant yellow eye that follows the player in the background. Now I don't know what mental space this idea came from, and I'm really curious and actually a little bit worried about what led to it. And then obviously I did it anyway, because of course I did. As we all know, everything ends, except the levels in this game apparently. Until now. I've gone this entire time without a way to actually win the level, which on the one hand would make the game sufficiently difficult, but on the other would probably get me a lot of very negative Steam reviews.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
I've also made some visual changes to float mode. You now get this little spinning ball for no adequate reason, and a faint vertical line filter over the screen. Both of these are just to visually let you know that yes, you are in float mode. I considered getting crazy with visual filters and really punching this up, but I don't really want people to use float mode unless they feel they have to, and it'd be strange to put so much effort into a feature that ideally I want the player to never see. So as long as it's visually clear that you're in some kind of different mode of play, that'll do. Plus, you know, effort. Remember lava? Lava's gone. I couldn't find a way to keep the fluid particles going without taking an unnecessary hit on performance, and all I needed it for was to lock off huge chunks of the level. Instead I've replaced it with spikes, because of course I have. They're huge, and in the project file they're known as the Crayola spike because they look like giant wax crayons. Their function is solely to create a kind of pit of death. I don't have the luxury of using an actual pit like in Super Mario, because the levels will often vary in verticality in the same level, so anytime I want you to not fall down a hole, there's now a massive spike instead. But the biggest thing I've done this week is... what's in a name? Surely a rose by any other name would still be a really stale metaphor. I could just tell you the name, but if you've watched this far then you probably know by now just how much I had to agonise over this seemingly irrelevant decision. A good name accomplishes a few things. One, it rolls nicely off the tongue and just sounds nice to say. Take Tetris, for example. It's punchy, short and to the point. It's also unique for the time and brands the game with something that can be built on in future iterations, even though that probably wasn't the original intention. Some names evoke a certain time period of gaming and the philosophies attached to them. Super Meat Boy, for example. The original Meat Boy was a Flash game, rest in peace Flash, so when it came to a fully featured sequel, Team Meat added the Super prefix. This is in keeping with the Super Nintendo era, where sequels to NES and arcade games would just slap Super on and call it done. Bringing to mind the Super Nintendo and the early 90s design philosophy sets you up for the nostalgic style of gameplay that Super Meat Boy excels at. If you want your game to sound grand and epic in scope, consider the colon. We all recall that the Lord of the Rings and Star Wars movies had a colon and then a subtitle, right? And each one of those subtitles led to a new grand chapter in the epic long-running tale. A franchise from day one, a universe even. So obviously using a colon and a subtitle gets you the same immediate reaction, right? Yeah, I dunno. Why not ask Lichdom colon Battle Mage or Remnant colon From the Ashes? I don't think this really works the way it's supposed to, but if you want to utilise a colon then you go ahead. My favourite type of game name is the one that encapsulates the theme of the game. Streets of Rage, for example, is all about the aesthetic. It sounds like an 80s pulp movie, and the game goes on to present that very well. VVV is about spikes, and it's named that way because the letter V written 6 times looks like some spikes. But the best example of this is The Legend of Zelda. The series isn't about Link, who you play as. It's about Zelda and her place in history, and how your destiny is interwoven with hers to the point that frankly, it's a good thing Link doesn't talk, because I imagine he'd just sound sick of having to do this nonsense for the last millennia, and just ask why she can't rescue herself for once. The very best game names capture more than one of these attributes. Hades is short and punchy, as well as familiar with its allusion to Greek mythology that just sounds cool, but it also captures the theme of the game incredibly well. You play as a guy called Zagreus, but the game's not really just about him. It's about his relationship with his dad, Hades. The simple but effective gameplay loop is contextualized with a tale of a young adult rebelling against his father figure, and brings in a lot of relatives for a weirdly light-hearted family drama set in hell. So I wanted a name that accomplished multiple things. I wanted a single word that sounded intriguing by itself, but also encapsulated some of the themes and, if I could, also the gameplay of the game. And so, after spending an embarrassingly long amount of time thinking about it, I settled on Untitled 2D Platformer. No, I didn't. The game is called Reiterate. Open bracket, close bracket. You don't actually pronounce the brackets out loud, but they're sort of integral to the name. Reiterate means to say or do something over and over again, to confirm the point you're trying to make. It means looping the same information until it's clear, which means, for example, repeatedly attempting the same level over and over until you clear it. You see how clever that is? Reiterate also relates to the optional plot that I mentioned last time. I don't want to reveal too much, but the basic context of the game is that there's somebody building robots, and they want to test those robots, and the levels that you're playing are a testing process to see if the robots are fit for what they want those robots to do. See how I've used the plot to contextualize the gameplay? Isn't that clever? And then there's the logo. The title is styled to look like what I think is a programming function. I can't program, so someone's going to have to fill me in on that. Hence the brackets and the letter I blinking like a text cursor. This ties into the development of the robot's AI, because it's so clever. See how clever that title is? Please validate my existence. No, but seriously, I just think it's a cool name, and it does sort of do everything I want it to do. And that's the end of this video. Oh, right. The thing about level design is it takes a long time. It is the meat of what I've got left to do, and it's going to take up multiple devlogs going forward. Put it this way, look how long I spent talking about a name, and then consider how much thought I must be putting into the levels. But I know I promised you level design, and I try to be a man of my word, so what we're going to do in this video is look at the design for the hardest level in the game. Sorry, I meant hardest to design. Anyone can make a difficult level. You just slap down spikes everywhere and call it a day. But level 1? That's a big one. What I need to do here is introduce multiple concepts and start reinforcing them to the player as soon as I can. We start off with this reasonably flat plane. Subsequent levels will play with verticality and exploration, but level 1 needs to be obvious and straightforward. You'll notice we started a big blank space. This is because what I want the player to do is just start playing around. They need to get used to moving and jumping, so there's a little ledge here that they're going to need to jump over. This will, hopefully, be instinctive. The audience I'm targeting for this game already know what jump is. They bought a platformer, they've played a few before, they're reasonably comfortable with the concept, but we'll introduce it anyway. Then there's a spike pit, not one that you'll ever fall into, but now we've confirmed that yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have spikes. This is thankfully codified very well in video games as a whole, but even if the player's never played a video game in their life and doesn't know that spikes are bad for you, they won't have much to redo if they die here. We reiterate that point, see what I did there, and then get to the first major hurdle, the wall jump. This mechanic is going to be integral to the rest of the game, so the player needs to know how this works. The first wall jump segment is two walls that are so close together that you can leap from one wall to the other just by pressing jump. This is the easiest that wall jumping will ever be in this game. Coming out of this jump, if the player is holding right, which most people do in platformers, they'll automatically land on this spring. The spring, you'll notice, comes before a short line of spikes. You can, if you want, just jump over these spikes with a single normal jump, so you're still not likely to die here. However, if they do what I want them to do, they'll realise that this is a spring and they'll see what springs do. Next, we're wall jumping again. This time with hovering spikes, which you're not likely to hit, but it's important to point out, hey, spikes can fly now. Adding hazards also adds to the visual idea that you're doing something more difficult than you actually are, which is an idea we're going to revisit frequently during level design later on. Unlike the last one, this wall jump can't be done just by pressing jump. You now have to turn into the direction you want to go. It's set up so that if you do just try pressing jump, you probably won't die, but if you do, it's level 1. It's not complicated and it won't take you long to get back here. If you figure this out, you'll have mastered turning into a wall jump for longer jump distances, and if you keep that up, you'll hit another spring, and if you keep holding right, you'll land on the jelly floor. The jelly floor, remember, acts like a spring but takes over from the flat platform. Because they're similar mechanics, I can introduce them in the same level. They both make the player jump without any input, so they're fine to pair together. Next, there's even more wall jumping. This one's trickier and needs a few more jumps in a row to get through, but there's little to no threat involved, so the player has space to figure it out. When you work this one out, you'll see a spring, which you've now been introduced to in your flight path. You'll also see this spinning spike bar introduced way out of reach of where you're likely to be. This is just to make you aware of it and say, hey, this is a thing you're going to have to deal with at some point. And that some point is right now. There's another spike bar in front of your next challenge which introduces smaller walls for wall jumping. What this does is signpost the player to where they need to aim their wall jumps, and again, looks more difficult than it is. What's likely is the player will execute a standard wall jump, hit the smaller wall with no issues whatsoever, and continue on past the row of floor spikes to the wider jelly floor. Remember the jelly floor from earlier? If you wanted to and you were unsure whether it was safe or not, you could have double jumped over it. That's okay, it doesn't matter, because here we're going to reinforce that it's actually fine to step on, because there's no other way past this section. We then have a big blank space, which is important for reasons I'll get to in another video, and then the final challenge of the level. Here I'm asking you to carry out what seems like a precise set of wall jumps to get over a combination hazard, made up of things you've already seen. By doing this, I'm making absolutely certain that before continuing, the player understands how to wall jump. The hazards are secondary really, because they're being used solely to signpost the player up to the parallel walls and over to the exit. Quick side note, speedrunners will most likely delay their first hop here, sliding down the wall a little bit to place a wall jump through this gap and complete the level that way, which is absolutely fine. It wasn't intentional, but I'm leaving it in. I've glossed over some very important topics here, but what you've seen so far is mechanic introduction, mechanic comprehension, and mechanic confirmation. This level exists to give the player room to start getting accustomed to the physics, understand their limitations, and learn a couple of key stage hazards and mechanics. It's also designed in line with a method that I call the perfect player philosophy, which I'll go into more detail about soon, whereby each level has a theoretical perfect run that a hypothetical perfect player could hit on the first attempt. What you also need to keep in mind whenever we're talking level design is that absolutely everything I've just said can, and possibly will, change once playtesting starts. That is incredibly important, and if you're designing levels, should always be in the back of your mind. I know that's a lot to take in, and I promise we're about to go so in depth on level design, so for now I will leave you with footage of this level from start to finish, if you were to be the hypothetical perfect player. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribe so you don't miss more of me talking for way too long about tiny inconsequential level design choices. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.